For 30 years, this case remains sealed in the basement archives of the Glacier County Sheriff's Department, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic red tape and what many believe was deliberate suppression by powerful political interests. The manila folder, yellowed with age and stamped "Classified, Do Not Distribute," contained over 400 pages of witness statements, crime scene photographs, and investigative reports that painted a picture so disturbing, so unthinkable, that local authorities made the unprecedented decision to classify the entire investigation under state security provisions, typically reserved for matters of national defense. Case number 660847 Multi sat untouched for decades, its contents known only to a handful of investigators who had sworn oaths of silence that many took to their graves. It wasn't until a routine digitization project in the summer of 2019 that a junior clerk named Sarah Blackfeather stumbled upon the file, its contents spilling out like ghosts from a tomb that had been sealed for far too long. What she discovered would shake the very foundations of everything the people of northwestern Montana thought they knew about the summer of 1966. The case centered around what became known internally as the Red Elk Commune incident, though that name never appeared in any public records or newspaper accounts from the time. 9 people lost their lives on the night of August 23, 1966, in what investigators determined was a ritualistic act of violence that defied every conventional understanding of human behavior. The official cause of death listed on all 9 death certificates was simply accidental fire, but the evidence contained within that classified file told a far different and infinitely more horrifying story. The suppression of this case wasn't merely the result of incompetence or oversight. Documents recently surfaced through Freedom of Information Act requests reveal a coordinated effort involving state legislators, federal officials, and what appears to have been significant pressure from the Blackfeet Nation Tribal Council, all working in concert to ensure that the truth about what happened in those remote mountains would never see the light of day. The reasons for this cover-up become clear when one examines the broader context of the time period and the explosive social tensions that were already threatening to tear apart the fabric of American society. In 1966, the United States was experiencing unprecedented social upheaval. The counterculture movement was gaining momentum, traditional religious institutions were being questioned and challenged, and alternative spiritual practices were attracting followers from all walks of life, particularly among young people disillusioned with conventional society.
The last thing authorities wanted was a case that would fuel existing fears about dangerous cults and religious extremism, especially one that involved both Native American spiritual practices and the kind of violence that could spark racial tensions in an already volatile region. The Red Elk Commune was established in the spring of 1965 by a charismatic leader known only as Father Mountain, whose real name investigators later discovered was Thomas Edward Kellerman, a former seminary student from Chicago who had abandoned his religious studies after what he described as a series of profound spiritual revelations during a vision quest on Blackfeet land. Kellerman had legally changed his name in 1964 and had spent nearly 2 years studying with various tribal elders before establishing his own spiritual community in the remote wilderness of Glacier National Park's eastern boundary. What made this case particularly sensitive was Father Mountain's claim that his spiritual authority had been granted directly by Blackfeet elders, an assertion that was vehemently denied by tribal leadership, but which had attracted a devoted following of both Native Americans and white seekers looking for authentic spiritual experience outside the confines of mainstream Christianity. The commune's location, nestled in a valley that held sacred significance to the Blackfeet people, only added to the complex web of cultural and political sensitivities that ultimately led to the case being buried. Before we continue with what happened in those mountains during the summer of 1966, if you're finding this case as compelling as I am, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Cases like this deserve to be heard, and your support helps us continue uncovering these hidden stories that powerful interests tried to bury. Now, back to northwestern Montana in the summer that changed everything. The landscape of Glacier County in 1966 was a study in contrasts that reflected the broader tensions tearing at American society. The eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains rose like ancient monuments from the Great Plains, their snow-capped peaks catching the first light of dawn and holding it like a promise throughout the long summer days. Below, the rolling prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, broken only by the meandering course of the Two Medicine River and the scattered homesteads of ranchers whose families had claimed this land 3 generations earlier. This was country that had been shaped by conflict from its earliest days. The Blackfeet Nation had called this region home for centuries before the arrival of European settlers, and the transition had been neither smooth nor peaceful. By 1966, the wounds of that history were still fresh, manifesting in the complex relationship between the reservation communities and the predominantly white ranching families who controlled much of the surrounding land.
It was a relationship built on mutual suspicion, economic necessity, and the kind of unspoken understanding that comes from sharing space with people you don't entirely trust but can't entirely avoid. The nearest town of any significant size was Cutbank, population 4,800, a community that existed primarily to service the agricultural needs of the surrounding ranches and the administrative requirements of the nearby reservation. Cutbank in 1966 was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the local newspaper ran wedding announcements and church socials on the front page, and where the arrival of strangers was noted and discussed with the intensity usually reserved for matters of national importance. It was into this insular world that Father Mountain and his followers had inserted themselves, purchasing a 640-acre tract of land in the foothills of the Rockies through a complex legal arrangement that involved both private sellers and lease agreements with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The land itself was spectacular, a hidden valley accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest and across 2 creek beds that became impassable during spring runoff. Ancient stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir provided natural shelter from the harsh mountain winds, while a series of natural hot springs created microclimates that allowed for limited agricultural activity even at the 4,200-foot elevation. The commune members had arrived in waves throughout 1965, initially drawing little attention from local residents who were accustomed to the seasonal influx of hunters, hikers, and tourists who came to experience the raw beauty of the northern Rockies. The first group consisted of Father Mountain himself, along with 3 devoted followers who had been with him since his early days studying with tribal elders. By autumn, their numbers had grown to 12, and by the spring of 1966, the Red Elk Commune was home to 23 adults and 6 children, ranging in age from 18 months to 16 years. What set this community apart from other alternative lifestyle experiments of the era was its explicit blending of Native American spiritual practices with what Father Mountain described as purified Christianity, a theological framework that rejected traditional church doctrine in favor of direct mystical experience and communion with what he termed the sacred forces of the natural world. This wasn't the casual appropriation of indigenous symbols and rituals that characterized many counterculture spiritual movements of the time, but rather an intensive program of study and practice that involved extended periods of fasting, vision quests, sweat lodge ceremonies, and other demanding spiritual disciplines. The physical layout of the commune reflected this spiritual focus.
The central area consisted of a large circular structure built from local timber and stone, designed to accommodate group ceremonies and communal meals. Surrounding this central lodge were smaller buildings housing individual families, a workshop for crafts and toolmaking, a communal kitchen and food storage area, and a schoolhouse where the children received their education according to principles that emphasized connection with nature and spiritual development over traditional academic subjects. The community was largely self-sufficient, growing much of their own food in carefully tended gardens that utilized both traditional Native American agricultural techniques and modern organic farming methods. They raised goats for milk and cheese, chickens for eggs, and maintained a small herd of horses that served both practical transportation needs and played important roles in their spiritual practices. The members who weren't engaged in agricultural work supported the community through various crafts, including pottery, weaving, leatherwork, and jewelry making, much of which was sold at markets in nearby towns and tourist areas. The economic relationship between the commune and the surrounding community was complex and often strained. While local businesses appreciated the money that commune members spent on supplies they couldn't produce themselves, many residents viewed the group with suspicion and hostility. The commune's rejection of mainstream religious practices was seen as a direct challenge to the conservative Christian values that dominated the region, while their adoption of Native American spiritual traditions struck many as either disrespectful appropriation or, worse, evidence of dangerous pagan influences.
These tensions were exacerbated by the commune's policy of welcoming anyone who demonstrated genuine spiritual commitment, regardless of their background or past. Among the group's members were former drug addicts seeking redemption, young people fleeing troubled family situations, military veterans struggling with trauma from service in Vietnam, and individuals who had been marginalized by mainstream society for various reasons. While Father Mountain insisted that all members undergo extensive spiritual purification before being fully accepted into the community, many locals saw the commune as a haven for society's undesirables and a potential threat to the safety and moral fabric of their region. The children of the commune presented another source of controversy. Local school officials had attempted on several occasions to force the commune to send their children to public schools, arguing that the community's educational program failed to meet state standards.
Father Mountain had successfully fought these efforts through legal channels, demonstrating that the children were receiving instruction that met or exceeded state requirements, while also providing them with spiritual and practical education that mainstream schools couldn't offer. However, rumors persisted about the nature of the children's upbringing, with some locals claiming that they were being subjected to inappropriate rituals and denied proper medical care. At the center of all these controversies stood Father Mountain himself, a figure who inspired either devoted loyalty or deep suspicion, with very little middle ground between the two extremes. Thomas Edward Kellerman had been born in 1932 to a middle-class Catholic family in Chicago, the youngest of 4 children, and the only one who showed any interest in religious vocation. His childhood had been marked by what his family described as an unusual sensitivity to spiritual matters, including claims of prophetic dreams and mystical experiences that began when he was barely 7 years old. After graduating from high school, Kellerman had entered St. Mary of the Lake Seminary with the intention of becoming a Catholic priest. His academic record was exemplary, and his devotion to prayer and spiritual discipline impressed his instructors. But by his 3rd year, he had begun to express doubts about traditional church doctrine and the institutional structure of organized religion. His journal entries from this period, which were later discovered and entered into evidence, reveal a young man struggling with profound questions about the nature of divine revelation and the relationship between formal religious practice and authentic spiritual experience. The crisis that led to Kellerman's departure from seminary occurred during Holy Week of 1954, when he experienced what he described as a series of visions that revealed to him the fundamental errors of institutional Christianity. According to his own accounts, he saw Christ himself appearing to him in dreams, explaining that the true message of Christianity had been corrupted by centuries of political manipulation and theological compromise. These visions, Kellerman claimed, showed him that authentic spiritual truth could only be found through direct communion with the natural world and the adoption of indigenous spiritual practices that predated the arrival of Christianity in the Americas. After leaving seminary, Kellerman had spent 2 years working various jobs in Chicago while pursuing independent study of Native American religions and spiritual practices. His interest in indigenous traditions wasn't merely academic. He had begun having what he described as calling dreams that seemed to be drawing him westward toward the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains.
In 1956, he had used his savings to purchase a used pickup truck and had driven to Montana, where he spent the next 8 years living among various tribal communities and learning from elders who were willing to share their knowledge with a sincere seeker. This period of Kellerman's life was shrouded in mystery, with few reliable records of his activities or whereabouts. What was known came primarily from tribal members who had encountered him during his wandering years, and their accounts painted a picture of a man driven by an almost desperate hunger for spiritual truth and willing to endure significant hardship in pursuit of his goals. He had participated in vision quests that lasted for days, had undergone purification ceremonies that pushed his body to its physical limits, and had studied under medicine men who rarely shared their knowledge with outsiders. The transformation from Thomas Kellerman to Father Mountain had occurred gradually, but witnesses described a man who had been fundamentally changed by his experiences. Where the former seminary student had been quiet and introspective, Father Mountain was charismatic and commanding, possessed of a presence that seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. He had developed a teaching style that combined elements of Christian mysticism with Native American wisdom traditions, creating a synthesis that attracted followers who were seeking something more authentic and demanding than conventional religious practice could provide. Father Mountain's physical appearance contributed to his magnetic appeal. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, with long black hair that he wore in traditional braids, he cut an imposing figure that seemed to embody the spiritual authority he claimed. His eyes, described by followers as the color of deep mountain lakes, were said to possess an intensity that could be both comforting and unsettling, depending on the circumstances. He typically dressed in clothing that blended Native American and frontier styles, wearing handcrafted leather garments decorated with traditional beadwork and carrying a medicine bag that he claimed contained sacred objects given to him by tribal elders. The first followers to join Father Mountain in establishing the commune were individuals who had encountered him during his years of spiritual seeking and had been profoundly affected by their experiences with him. Sarah Windwalker, whose birth name was Sandra Williams, had been a troubled teenager from a broken home in Minneapolis when she first met Father Mountain at a powwow in 1963. She had been struggling with drug addiction and depression, feeling lost and disconnected from any sense of purpose or meaning in her life, when something about Father Mountain's presence had sparked a transformation that her family described as miraculous.
Under Father Mountain's guidance, Sarah had undergone a complete spiritual rebirth that involved not only overcoming her addiction, but developing what appeared to be genuine psychic abilities and a deep connection to natural spiritual forces. She became Father Mountain's closest disciple and eventually his spiritual partner, though they never formally married according to either legal or traditional religious customs. Sarah served as the commune's primary spiritual counselor for women and children, and her gentle nature and obvious devotion to Father Mountain's teachings helped convince many skeptical parents that their children would be safe and well cared for in the community. Michael Strongbear, originally Michael Patterson from Detroit, had found his way to Father Mountain after a devastating tour of duty in Vietnam that had left him struggling with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The conventional psychiatric treatment available in 1964 had been inadequate to address the depth of his trauma, and he had been cycling through a series of failed relationships and dead-end jobs when a chance encounter with Father Mountain at a veterans gathering had offered him a different path toward healing. Under Father Mountain's guidance, Michael had undergone a series of intensive healing ceremonies that had gradually allowed him to process his war experiences and find peace with the violence he had witnessed and participated in. His transformation was so complete that his own family barely recognized him when he visited them before joining the commune permanently. Where he had once been angry and unpredictable, he became calm and centered, radiating the kind of inner peace that came from having confronted his darkest experiences and emerged whole on the other side. The third core member of Father Mountain's inner circle was an elderly woman known as Grandmother Willow, whose legal name was Ruth Blackhorse. Unlike the other followers, Grandmother Willow was actually Native American, a member of the Blackfeet Nation who had been born on the reservation in 1897 and had lived through the transition from traditional tribal life to the modern era. Her decision to join Father Mountain's community had been controversial within her own family and tribe, as many viewed it as a betrayal of traditional ways and an endorsement of what they saw as spiritual appropriation by white outsiders. Grandmother Willow's presence in the commune served multiple purposes beyond her role as an elder and spiritual guide. Her knowledge of traditional plants, medicines, and healing practices was extensive, and she served as the community's primary healthcare provider, treating everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses, using methods that had been passed down through generations of tribal healers.
More importantly, her presence provided a degree of legitimacy to Father Mountain's claims about having been taught by Native American elders, though this legitimacy was hotly disputed by tribal authorities, who insisted that no recognized medicine person had ever authorized the teaching of sacred traditions to outsiders. As word of the commune and its unusual spiritual practices spread throughout the region and beyond, new members continued to arrive, each bringing their own story of spiritual seeking and personal transformation. Among them was David Clearwater, a former Methodist minister from Ohio, who had experienced a crisis of faith that had led him to abandon his congregation and family in search of more authentic spiritual truth. David's theological background made him valuable to Father Mountain as someone who could help articulate the community's beliefs in terms that might be more accessible to visitors and potential converts from Christian backgrounds. The commune also attracted several families with children, including Robert and Mary Sunhart, formerly Robert and Mary Johnson from California, who had brought their 3 young children to the community after becoming convinced that mainstream society was spiritually bankrupt and potentially dangerous for sensitive children. The Sunharts had been active in various alternative spiritual movements throughout the early 1960s, but they found in Father Mountain's teachings a combination of rigor and authenticity that had been missing from their previous experiences. Another family that joined the commune in early 1966 was headed by James Firekeeper, originally James McKinley from Texas,
who had brought his teenage daughter Rebecca after his wife's death from cancer had left him questioning everything he had previously believed about the nature of life and death. James had heard about Father Mountain through a network of spiritual seekers and had made the journey to Montana, hoping to find answers to questions that conventional religion had been unable to address. The daily life of the commune was structured around a complex schedule of spiritual practices, communal work, and educational activities that began before dawn and continued until well after sunset. Each day started with a sunrise ceremony that brought all community members together for prayer, meditation, and the sharing of dreams and visions from the previous night. These morning gatherings were led by Father Mountain himself and provided an opportunity for him to offer spiritual guidance and instruction while also addressing any practical matters that needed attention. Following the sunrise ceremony, community members would disperse to their various work assignments, which were rotated regularly to ensure that everyone gained experience in all aspects of communal life.
Some would tend to the gardens and livestock, others would work in the craft workshops or food preparation areas, and still others would focus on construction and maintenance projects that were constantly needed to improve and expand the community's infrastructure. The children of the commune received their formal education during the morning hours, following a curriculum that emphasized both traditional academic subjects and spiritual development. Classes were held outdoors whenever weather permitted, and the teaching methods incorporated hands-on learning experiences that connected abstract concepts to practical applications in the natural world. The children learned mathematics through garden planning and construction projects, studied history through the oral traditions of various indigenous peoples, and developed their writing skills by keeping detailed journals of their spiritual experiences and daily observations. Afternoons were typically devoted to more intensive spiritual practices, including individual meditation, group prayer sessions, and various forms of ceremonial activity that changed according to the seasons and the specific spiritual needs of the community. Father Mountain placed great emphasis on what he called earth connection, requiring all community members to spend significant time alone in nature, learning to communicate with what he described as the spiritual forces that inhabited the natural world. Evenings brought the community together again for communal meals, storytelling, and group discussions about spiritual matters and community concerns. These gatherings were often the most intense and meaningful part of the day, as Father Mountain would share his latest revelations and insights while encouraging community members to discuss their own spiritual experiences and challenges. The conversations could continue for hours, with participants describing visions, dreams, and mystical experiences that seemed to validate Father Mountain's teachings about the possibility of direct communion with divine forces. As the summer of 1966 progressed, however, subtle changes began to appear in the rhythm and character of these evening gatherings. Father Mountain's teachings became increasingly focused on themes of spiritual purification and the need to prepare for what he described as an approaching time of testing that would determine who among the community members possessed the spiritual strength necessary to advance to higher levels of consciousness. He began to speak more frequently about the corrupting influence of the outside world and the need for the community to separate itself more completely from contact with mainstream society. These changes coincided with a series of disturbing incidents that had begun to strain the commune's relationship with the surrounding community and had attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement officials.
In June, a teenage girl from Cutbank had disappeared after being seen talking with commune members at a farmer's market, sparking fears that she had been recruited or kidnapped by the group. The girl had eventually returned home on her own after 3 days, claiming that she had simply been exploring the possibility of joining the commune, but had decided against it. However, her account of her experiences had included descriptions of ceremonies and practices that many locals found deeply disturbing. The situation had been further complicated by reports from former commune members who had left the group and were now speaking publicly about their experiences. While most of these accounts focused on relatively minor complaints about the demanding nature of community life and Father Mountain's authoritarian leadership style, some included more serious allegations about psychological manipulation, inappropriate sexual behavior, and the use of dangerous substances during spiritual ceremonies. The testimonies of these former members painted an increasingly disturbing picture of life within the Red Elk Commune during its final months. Sarah Mitchell, who had left the group in early 1966 after spending nearly 2 years there, described a gradual shift in Father Mountain's behavior and teachings. What had initially attracted her to the commune was its promise of spiritual enlightenment and communal living based on love and mutual support. However, she witnessed the leader becoming increasingly paranoid and controlling, implementing strict rules about contact with the outside world and demanding absolute obedience from his followers. Mitchell's account detailed how Father Mountain had begun conducting what he called purification ceremonies with increasing frequency throughout 1965 and into 1966. These rituals, which initially involved meditation, fasting, and the consumption of herbal teas, had evolved into more extreme practices that included the use of hallucinogenic substances and exposure to extreme temperatures. She described how members were encouraged to confess their spiritual impurities during these sessions, often while under the influence of mind-altering substances that Father Mountain claimed would help them achieve higher consciousness. Another former member, Robert Chen, who had been one of Father Mountain's closest disciples before leaving the commune in March 1966, provided even more troubling details about the group's final months. Chen spoke of how Father Mountain had become obsessed with what he termed the final cleansing, a concept that seemed to evolve from the leader's interpretation of various religious and philosophical texts he had been studying. According to Chen, Father Mountain believed that only through complete purification of both body and spirit could his followers achieve the transcendent state necessary to survive what he predicted would be an imminent collapse of modern civilization.
The commune's isolation in the remote Montana wilderness had made it increasingly difficult for concerned family members and authorities to monitor the situation. The property was located nearly 30 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable during heavy snow or rain. This geographical isolation, which Father Mountain had deliberately chosen for its spiritual benefits, also served to shield the group's activities from outside scrutiny during the critical period when his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. Local law enforcement had received sporadic reports about the commune throughout its existence, but most of these complaints had been relatively minor matters related to property disputes with neighboring ranchers or concerns about the group's unconventional lifestyle. Sheriff Department records from this period show that deputies had visited the commune on several occasions, but these visits had typically resulted in reassurances from Father Mountain and his followers that everything was functioning normally within their community. The transformation of Father Mountain's spiritual philosophy during this period reflected broader cultural tensions that were emerging across American society in the mid-1960s. The counterculture movement, with its emphasis on alternative spirituality, communal living, and rejection of mainstream values, had attracted thousands of young people seeking meaning and purpose outside traditional institutions. However, the lack of oversight and the charismatic nature of many spiritual leaders had created conditions where vulnerable individuals could be exploited and manipulated by those claiming divine authority or special spiritual insight. Father Mountain's increasing focus on purification rituals appeared to be influenced by his study of various religious traditions, including certain interpretations of Christian mysticism, Eastern meditation practices, and Native American spiritual ceremonies. However, his understanding and application of these traditions had become distorted through his own psychological issues and his desire to maintain absolute control over his followers. Former members described how he would spend hours lecturing about the need to eliminate all worldly attachments and impurities, often while displaying signs of mental instability that his devoted followers interpreted as evidence of his spiritual advancement. The economic pressures facing the commune during this period had also contributed to the deteriorating situation. The group's agricultural efforts had been largely unsuccessful due to the harsh Montana climate and the members' lack of farming experience. Their attempts to generate income through craft sales and small-scale manufacturing had similarly failed to provide adequate financial support for the growing community.
These economic difficulties had created additional stress and had led Father Mountain to become even more controlling and demanding in his leadership style. By the summer of 1966, the combination of psychological manipulation, social isolation, economic hardship, and Father Mountain's increasingly unstable mental state had created a volatile situation within the Red Elk Commune. The remaining members, many of whom had severed ties with their families and had nowhere else to go, found themselves completely dependent on their leader for both physical survival and spiritual guidance. This dependency had made it extremely difficult for them to recognize the danger they were in, or to take action to protect themselves and their children. The events that would ultimately lead to tragedy began to unfold on the evening of August 15, 1966, during what Father Mountain announced would be the most important purification ceremony in the commune's history. According to survivor testimonies collected later by investigators, the leader had spent the previous week preparing his followers for what he described as their final transformation into beings of pure spiritual energy. He had required all members to fast for 3 days and to participate in intensive meditation sessions that often lasted throughout the night.
On that fateful evening, Father Mountain gathered his remaining 23 followers in the large wooden structure that served as the commune's meeting hall and spiritual center. The building, which had been constructed by the members themselves using timber from the surrounding forest, was located at the center of the compound and could accommodate the entire community for group activities. Witnesses later described how Father Mountain appeared unusually agitated and spoke with increasing intensity about the need for complete purification and the elimination of all earthly attachments. The ceremony began with the usual elements of meditation, chanting, and the consumption of herbal preparations that Father Mountain claimed had special spiritual properties. However, as the evening progressed, the leader's behavior became increasingly erratic and his demands more extreme. He began speaking about the need for his followers to prove their commitment to the spiritual path by demonstrating their willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of purification. The exact sequence of events that followed would later become the subject of extensive investigation and legal proceedings. According to the accounts of the survivors, Father Mountain had prepared a large fire in the center of the meeting hall, claiming that the flames represented the purifying power of divine love. He instructed his followers to approach the fire and to allow its heat to burn away their remaining impurities. Initially, this appeared to be a symbolic gesture, with members simply standing near the flames and reciting spiritual affirmations.
However, Father Mountain's demands gradually escalated, and he began insisting that true purification required direct contact with the cleansing fire. The psychological state of the commune members at this point was severely compromised by months of manipulation, sleep deprivation, inadequate nutrition, and the influence of the psychoactive substances they had consumed during the ceremony. Many were in a highly suggestible condition and were unable to think clearly about the dangerous nature of their leader's instructions. The combination of religious fervor, group pressure, and altered consciousness created a situation where rational judgment had been severely impaired. The first victims were among Father Mountain's most devoted followers, individuals who had been with the commune since its early days and who had demonstrated unwavering loyalty to their leader's teachings. These members, believing completely in Father Mountain's spiritual authority and convinced that their sacrifice would lead to transcendence, willingly subjected themselves to the flames in what they believed was an act of ultimate devotion. The other members, witnessing these horrific events while under the influence of mind-altering substances and psychological manipulation, were unable to intervene effectively or to recognize the reality of what was happening. The tragedy continued to unfold as Father Mountain, apparently convinced of his own divine mission, continued to encourage additional members to participate in the purification ritual. The combination of religious fanaticism, psychological manipulation, and the altered mental state of all participants created a nightmarish scenario that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The few members who retained enough clarity to recognize the danger found themselves unable to stop the events that were taking place or to convince their fellow believers that their leader had lost all connection to reality. The immediate aftermath of these events was characterized by chaos and confusion as the surviving members struggled to comprehend what had happened and to deal with the medical emergency facing those who had been injured during the ceremony. The commune's isolation meant that professional medical help was hours away, and several of the victims died from their injuries before any assistance could arrive. The survivors, many of whom were also suffering from psychological trauma and the effects of the substances they had consumed, were initially unable to provide coherent accounts of what had transpired. It was not until the following morning that one of the survivors, Margaret Stevens, managed to reach the nearest telephone and contact emergency services. Stevens, who had joined the commune only a few months earlier and had maintained some skepticism about Father Mountain's more extreme teachings, had hymned during the worst of the ceremony and had avoided participating in the purification ritual.
Her phone call to the sheriff's department at approximately 9:30 on the morning of August 16th was the first indication that authorities had of the tragedy that had occurred at the Red Elk Commune. The initial response by local law enforcement and emergency medical personnel was complicated by the remote location of the commune and the difficulty of accessing the property with emergency vehicles. Sheriff William Morrison, who led the first team of responders to reach the scene, later described the situation they encountered as unlike anything he had experienced in 20 years of law enforcement. The meeting hall contained evidence of the horrific events that had taken place, and several victims were still alive but in critical condition, requiring immediate medical evacuation. The investigation that followed would prove to be one of the most complex and disturbing cases in Montana's criminal history. The remote location, the unusual circumstances surrounding the deaths, and the psychological state of the survivors all presented significant challenges for investigators attempting to piece together exactly what had happened during that fateful evening. The fact that many of the witnesses had been under the influence of psychoactive substances and had been subjected to months of psychological manipulation made it difficult to obtain reliable testimony about the events. Detective Lieutenant James Crawford of the Montana State Police was assigned to lead the investigation due to his experience with complex criminal cases and his background in psychology. Crawford and his team spent weeks interviewing survivors, examining physical evidence, and attempting to understand the psychological dynamics that had led to such a tragic outcome. The investigation revealed a pattern of escalating manipulation and control that had gradually transformed what began as a peaceful spiritual community into a dangerous cult under the absolute dominion of an unstable leader. The physical evidence collected at the scene provided crucial insights into events of August 15th. Forensic specialists found traces of various psychoactive substances in the meeting hall, including compounds derived from plants that Father Mountain had been cultivating on the commune property. Analysis of these substances revealed that some had powerful hallucinogenic properties that would have severely impaired the judgment and perception of anyone who consumed them. The investigators also discovered extensive documentation of Father Mountain's spiritual teachings and philosophical writings, which showed a clear progression from relatively benign New Age concepts to increasingly dangerous and delusional beliefs about purification and transcendence. One of the most significant breakthroughs in the investigation came when detectives discovered Father Mountain's private journals, which he had been keeping since the commune's founding.
These writings provided a disturbing window into the leader's deteriorating mental state and his growing obsession with concepts of spiritual purity and divine mission. The journals revealed that Father Mountain had been planning the purification ceremony for months and had come to believe that only through extreme sacrifice could his followers achieve the transformation necessary to survive what he predicted would be the end of the material world. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Father Mountain had been deliberately isolating his followers from outside influences and had been systematically undermining their ability to think independently or question his authority. Former members provided testimony about how the leader had used various psychological techniques, including sleep deprivation, nutritional manipulation, and constant indoctrination, to maintain control over the commune members. This evidence would prove crucial in establishing the criminal nature of Father Mountain's actions and in demonstrating that the victims had been unable to give meaningful consent to participate in the dangerous ritual. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that several local officials had been aware of concerning reports about the commune, but had failed to take appropriate action to investigate these allegations or to ensure the safety of the community members. This revelation led to a broader examination of the responsibilities of law enforcement and social services agencies in monitoring and responding to reports of potentially dangerous religious or spiritual groups. The criminal proceedings that followed the investigation were closely watched throughout Montana and attracted national attention as one of the first major cases involving what would later be recognized as cult-related violence. Father Mountain, whose real name was revealed to be Thomas Morrison, was arrested and charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous other charges related to child endangerment, assault, and the administration of controlled substances. The prosecution faced the challenging task of proving that Morrison had deliberately caused the deaths of his followers, while overcoming potential defenses based on religious freedom and the apparent willingness of the victims to participate in the ceremony. The trial began on March 15, 1967, in the District Court in Helena, Montana, with Judge Robert Patterson presiding. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Sullivan, argued that Morrison had used psychological manipulation and mind-altering substances to coerce his followers into participating in a ritual that he knew would result in their deaths. The prosecution presented extensive evidence about the leader's deteriorating mental state, his use of dangerous substances to control his followers, and his systematic isolation of the commune members from outside support or assistance.
The defense team, headed by attorney David Richardson, faced the difficult task of defending a client whose actions had resulted in the deaths of 9 people, including 3 children. Richardson argued that Morrison had genuinely believed in the spiritual validity of the purification ceremony and had not intended to cause harm to his followers. The defense contended that the deaths were the result of a tragic accident that occurred during a legitimate religious ceremony, and that Morrison's mental illness had impaired his ability to recognize the dangerous nature of his actions. The testimony of the survivors proved to be the most compelling and emotionally difficult aspect of the trial. Margaret Stevens, who had been the first to contact authorities after the tragedy, provided a detailed account of life within the commune and described the gradual escalation of Morrison's demands for absolute obedience and participation in increasingly dangerous rituals. Her testimony revealed the psychological techniques that Morrison had used to maintain control over his followers and the atmosphere of fear and dependency that had developed within the community. Other survivors, including several who had been seriously injured during the purification ceremony, testified about their experiences and their understanding of the events that had led to the tragedy. Many of these witnesses struggled with feelings of guilt and responsibility for not having done more to prevent the deaths of their fellow commune members. Their testimony provided crucial insights into the psychological dynamics that had made it possible for Morrison to convince his followers to participate in such a dangerous ritual. The prosecution also called expert witnesses in psychology and psychiatry to explain the methods of psychological manipulation that Morrison had employed and to describe the mental state of the commune members at the time of the purification ceremony. These experts testified about the effects of isolation, sleep deprivation, and psychoactive substances on decision-making capacity, and explained how Morrison's systematic manipulation had rendered his followers unable to recognize the danger they were in or to resist his demands. The defense presented its own expert witnesses who testified about Morrison's mental illness and argued that he had been suffering from severe psychological disorders that had impaired his judgment and his ability to understand the consequences of his actions. The defense experts described Morrison as a deeply disturbed individual who had become convinced of his own divine mission and who genuinely believed that the purification ceremony would result in spiritual transcendence rather than physical harm. The trial lasted for 6 weeks and included testimony from more than 40 witnesses. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts of first-degree murder, along with convictions on most of the other charges.
Judge Patterson sentenced Morrison to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, noting that the defendant's actions had demonstrated a callous disregard for human life and had exploited the trust and vulnerability of his followers. The legal proceedings also included separate trials for several commune members who had survived the purification ceremony, but who had been charged with various crimes related to their failure to protect the children who had died during the ritual. These cases raised complex questions about the criminal responsibility of individuals who had themselves been victims of psychological manipulation and who had been under the influence of mind-altering substances at the time of the events. Most of these defendants ultimately received suspended sentences or were ordered to undergo psychological treatment and community service. The aftermath of the Red Elk Commune tragedy had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case prompted significant changes in how law enforcement agencies approached reports of potentially dangerous religious or spiritual groups and led to the development of new protocols for investigating allegations of abuse or exploitation within isolated communities. The tragedy also contributed to growing public awareness of the dangers posed by charismatic leaders who used religious or spiritual authority to manipulate and control vulnerable individuals. Many of the survivors struggled with long-term psychological trauma as a result of their experiences within the commune and their witnessing of the tragic events of August 15, 1966. Several required extensive therapy and counseling to overcome the effects of the psychological manipulation they had endured and to process their feelings of guilt and responsibility for the deaths of their fellow community members. Some survivors found it difficult to trust religious or spiritual institutions for many years after their experiences, while others eventually found healing through their connection to more mainstream religious communities. The families of the victims faced their own challenges in coming to terms with the loss of their loved ones and in understanding how their family members had become involved with such a dangerous group. Many struggled with feelings of anger and blame, both toward Morrison and toward themselves for not having done more to intervene before the tragedy occurred. Some families found support through victim advocacy groups and through connections with other families who had lost loved ones to similar cult-related violence. The Red Elk Commune property was eventually sold to pay legal costs and to provide some compensation to the families of the victims. The buildings were demolished and the land was converted to agricultural use.
A small memorial was erected at the site to honor the memory of those who died, but the location remains largely unmarked and is known only to local residents and to those who study the history of the case. The case of the Red Elk Commune became an important precedent in the legal treatment of cult-related violence and contributed to the development of new approaches to identifying and intervening in situations where religious or spiritual groups posed a danger to their members. Law enforcement agencies began to develop specialized training programs to help officers recognize the warning signs of potentially dangerous groups and to understand the psychological dynamics that make intervention so challenging in these situations. The tragedy also prompted academic research into the psychological and sociological factors that contribute to the development of dangerous cults and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals by charismatic leaders. This research has helped to identify risk factors and warning signs that can be used to prevent similar tragedies and to develop more effective interventions for individuals who have become involved with potentially dangerous groups. Thomas Morrison remained in prison until his death in 1987, never showing remorse for his actions or acknowledging responsibility for the deaths of his followers. He continued to maintain that the purification ceremony had been a legitimate spiritual practice and that the deaths had been an unfortunate accident rather than the result of his deliberate actions. His refusal to accept responsibility for the tragedy added to the pain experienced by the survivors and the families of the victims. The legacy of the Red Elk Commune tragedy serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers posed by individuals who exploit religious or spiritual authority to manipulate and control others. The case demonstrates how isolation, psychological manipulation, and the abuse of trust can create conditions where rational individuals can be convinced to participate in dangerous or self-destructive behaviors. It also highlights the importance of maintaining connections to outside support systems and the need for communities to remain vigilant for signs of exploitation or abuse within religious or spiritual organizations. The story of the Red Elk Commune raises profound questions about the nature of religious freedom and the extent to which society has a responsibility to protect individuals from the harmful actions of those who claim spiritual authority. While the right to practice one's religion freely is a fundamental principle of democratic society, the case demonstrates that this freedom can be exploited by those who seek to harm others in the name of spiritual enlightenment. The challenge for law enforcement and social service agencies is to identify and respond to genuine threats, while respecting the legitimate rights of religious communities to practice their beliefs without interference.
The tragedy at the Red Elk Commune also serves as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of individuals who are seeking meaning and purpose in their lives, and who may be susceptible to the influence of charismatic leaders promising spiritual transformation or transcendence. The case demonstrates the importance of maintaining critical thinking skills and skepticism when evaluating claims of special spiritual knowledge or divine authority, particularly when such claims are accompanied by demands for absolute obedience or the severing of ties with family and friends. As we reflect on this dark chapter in Montana's history, we are forced to confront difficult questions about human nature and the capacity for both good and evil that exists within religious and spiritual movements. The individuals who died at the Red Elk Commune were not evil or foolish people. They were sincere seekers who trusted in a leader who ultimately betrayed that trust in the most horrific way possible. Their deaths serve as a reminder that the search for spiritual meaning and transcendence, while noble in itself, can sometimes lead us into dangerous territory when we surrender our critical faculties to those who claim to have all the answers. In an age when new religious and spiritual movements continue to emerge and attract followers seeking alternatives to traditional institutions, the lessons of the Red Elk Commune remain as relevant today as they were in 1966. How do we balance our respect for religious freedom with our responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals from those who would exploit their spiritual seeking for personal gain or destructive purposes?